Okay, this video is in regards to week 8, the skeletal-articular system. And I want to say something. I understand that the degree being in clinical ex-phys, we think immediately about cardiorespiratory rehab and what exactly do we do in the clinic. But the person coming in is not just their heart and lungs. So I do see valuable information in the upcoming chapters and topics. And if you look carefully and you think for a second, you'll see that the information here will help you understand better how to exercise them and how to achieve better results for them. Obviously, the episode of today, the chapter, sorry, of today includes basic knowledge that you're supposed to know, and I still went over it. And a few ideas that are a bit more advanced. And I'll highlight some topics and I'll leap over some topics. The basic anatomy, I think you can deal with yourself. It's basic knowledge. You should have learned it in your bachelor's degree. But yet still, if you have any questions, just let me know. So let's start. I'm going to jump automatically to slide number 4. So, of course, we have to understand the importance of this system. Obviously, it's a system in the body and we can't disregard it. But the question is, how important is it? So we know that it serves as a system of protection. So any weakening of the system will lead to injuries. When we're talking about the average age of people that we're going to see in the clinic, obviously it's going to be what we call advanced age adults or the elderly, right? We might see young people as well, but still this system has to protect them. And obviously we don't want anyone injured, and ever more so because when they're injured they can't exercise, we're losing all the effect of rehab that we want for them, and we're also going to be talking about immobilization. The second aspect that you know very well about is that the bones serve the levers. The levers are tools to create movement, and movement is exercise. And without these levers functioning the best they can per gender and age and health and training status, movement is decreased relatively to the potential, and then exercise is decreased relatively to the potential, and then adaptation to exercise, aka rehabilitation, is decreased. We know that function, turnover of cells and functionality and changes to the morphology of the bones are influenced by exercise, so it's a major inducer of changes, and it's very, very important. Look, how many of us think that our patients should, go through a DEXA scan, a bone density scan once half a year? How many of us actually have it on the list to influence our patients to actually have those scans? Most of us don't, and it only happens when there's a problem. So I think it should be routine, and I hope that once we go over the presentation for this week, you'll agree with me. All right, so that's one of the goals that I have in this video. One of the major factors that influences adaptation in the bones is what we call strain, meaning some kind of mechanical force. Especially, we want to make sure that we pay notice to the magnitude, the frequency, the rate, and the gradient, the differences that we are creating. What we're going to see is major changes in the deformation of the bone, and that does not necessarily is taken in a negative way. And fluid flow. People think that bones are dead. They're not dead. They're alive. There's fluids in there, and the amount of fluid flow and the areas within the bone where we see that flow definitely influence the extent and localization of the adaptation. Let's see. We know that bone mass is basically the most researched aspect of bones. We know that exercise and age and nutrition and even psychological status and many other factors that we will talk about influence the bones, and it's important to understand that, and it's important for us as clinicians, if you get the point of what I'm saying, to address that when a patient comes in. Do we necessarily do that? No, we usually leave it to others, and I think that that's a mistake. Okay, slide 6, I'm gonna just leap over that. That's kind of basic anatomy and physiology, so functionality, so I think you can read that on your own. Same thing about slide number 7, basic anatomy. Just go over it, and if you have questions, send them my way. Okay, when we're talking about all these changes to content, we have to understand that the content of a tissue and its changes, for better and for worse, are going to change the outcomes of adaptation. When we talk about fluids within tissues, within cells, within an organ, we have to understand that fluid has a few characteristics that can be used in different ways. One, fluids are not condensed usually easily, so they act as a resistance factor, meaning that the more fluids you have in a tissue or a cell, the more resistant to mechanical forces that tissue or cell is going to be. On the other hand, fluids help conduct electricity. Fluids help keeping the tissue alive. Fluids are easy mediums to transport things, dissolve things. Fluids are great to absorb heat, which is one of the natural threats to a cell. We don't want to burn the cell to death, so to speak. So when we have fluid resistance during loading, mechanical loading on the bones, we see that we have an increase in that. And that's part of the major process. Although we do not understand these processes to the letter, we know that fluid resistance and fluid flow and fluid content is one of the major mediators of adaptation in general and the localization of adaptation to exercise, and this is important to rehab. I think that slide number 9 is kind of basic in the sense of talking about the meniscus, and once again, if you have questions, just forward them to me. So if we look at the bone tissue, and this once again is basic structure and functionality, one of the principles that we continue to talk about, structure and functionality, anatomy and physiology. We know that we have different types of tissue within the bone. We have stronger areas, we have softer areas, what we call compact bone versus softer tissue. And the ratio between those two and the amount of fluids or water in the bone definitely have a role to play in the reaction and the adaptation to exercise. the less compact bone and water that you have, the less adaptation or the less quality of adaptation we will have. Of course, when a bone is injured, according to age and gender and training status and health, of course, we see a turnover of the damaged areas. The older we get, the harder it is to correct and have what we call a turnover on the damaged cells, meaning replacing cells with newer cells or better cells. When we talk about low cellularity and vascularity that are great for mechanical function in a way, in the sense that the loading is lower and less limiting to that tissue, it also works against the cell when you want to improve metabolic capacity within these bones. So there's a balance here, and nothing is perfect. There's always advantages and disadvantages. Let's see. We know that in viable tissues, bone tissue, complete turnover, meaning the complete repairment of the whole tissue can occur within 3 years, which sounds slow, but once again, the fact that you have that ability is within itself a good thing. We'll see and hear again and again about modeling and remodeling, two major processes that pertain to tissues and tissue damage and adaptation to exercise. So bones react to both, not necessarily at the same time and not necessarily at the same extent. When we talk about modeling, we're talking about a process at the cellular level, meaning at the level of the cells, and we're talking about the formation of the bone and resorption, meaning changes to size and shape of the bones. We can see remodeling, whereas remodeling, as it sounds from the word itself, are changes to existing cells and tissues. So modeling would be, for instance, very extensive in growth, and remodeling would be more characteristic of a grown or mature tissue, although both can exist parallel. Okay, let's talk about tissue adaptation. So we're jumping to slide number 14 in the presentation. Notice that 80% of bone mineral density, BMD, or peak bone mineral density, is due to genetic factors. So that sounds like a lot, as if things are already locked in and you have no influence, but don't forget that we have 20% left to affect that. And also notice that it's up to 80%, so it can be even lower. The rest is environmental, and if it's environmental, it means that the clinical exercise physiologist is part of that environment. So exercise would be, in this case, environmental. So obviously we'll use a DEXA or any other method of quantifying bone density or bone mineral density. So once again, if you ever start a clinic, if you're near to a clinic with a DEXA, I would definitely recommend periodical checks on that, and it also can show you the improvement of your loading method or loading extent through your workout plan for your patients. One of the major things that we know, according to load, is that it's not linear. and it's not exponential. It's actually acting like a bell curve, or what we call a Gaussian curve, meaning that not enough load, mechanical load in this case, will induce changes to tissue, in this case most likely negative loading, and I'm talking about a normal bone. I'm not talking about someone that is injured right now and needs to rest. That's not what we're talking about. And too much load will equally lead to injuries and changes to the bone that are not necessarily positive. That's why loading has to be accurate, has to be suitable, and has to take in consideration all the personal factors of the person. We know that the ligaments adapt to loading better than any other tissue, which is not very surprising if you think about the role that a ligament has. Okay, let's see. So immobilization, the lack of movement, will obviously reduce or take adaptations to the negative part of things. Is going to reduce the ability of the tissue to cope with day-to-day tasks and obviously exercise. So it's important to give rest to the articular system, but also induce stimuli quite often. And you can see in slide 16 something that I think is basic knowledge, and the inner content changes within the fibers and their structure that obviously leads to changes in functionality. Let's see. Okay, so we can see that on slide 17 that daily activities, regardless of exercise, notice regardless of exercise, may maintain up to 90% of ligament mechanical properties. That's a good thing, because that means that the ligament is highly reactive even to day-to-day functionalities and activities. Otherwise we'd have to exercise people way more. And the rest of the 10% is due to exercise. Don't forget that 10% is a lot, especially in advanced aged people. Okay. Alright, so at the end of slide 18, you can see the third point is the amount of time, the length of time that it takes tendons to adapt and show improvement to exercise. So that's an important part of functionality, and that means that if someone came into rehab after being completely inactive, and we know that that's one of the major reasons that people have cardiorespiratory problems and overall body problems. So that shouldn't be, you know, that would be a common factor or characteristic of one of your future patients. You can expect within 7 weeks to see a certain jump, so to speak, in the ability to exercise, if only due to tendon improvement. And just remember that the tendon is the tissue that is conveying the force from the muscles to the bone, meaning that without it, levers cannot function in the body. Let's see. I'm going to jump over slide 19. It's kind of general information that would be nice for you to know. Slide 20. Part of the changes and decrease in ability due to immobilization is not only because of the loading and the structure, but also the content changes to the tissue. So we have loss of content or important content that leads to changes in our ability to function. Notice that we know that nutrition is a major aspect, of course, of body function. That's almost unneeded to be said. But exercise is definitely a major inducer of nutrient changes to the body and especially to the bones. When we talk about the lack of exercise, and we'll learn about this in another chapter, we talk about the starvation process. So lack of exercise induces lack of nutrients that is perceived by the tissue as starvation, and we'll learn what happens to the body during starvation beyond what you can already imagine or extrapolate regarding, metabolic pathways and so on and so forth. Of course, immobilization will affect maturation. I just want to remind you that bones still mature until the age of 35 in some people and 30 in the majority of the population. So when we say maturation, don't think about a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old. We can also be talking about a 25-year-old or even a 29-year-old. And that's very, very important. And that means that whatever we do with these people is going to affect their ability to cope with diseases later on. And that's obviously a problem because, how do you tell a 22-year-old that they better take care of their bones because they might have a cardiac event when they're 60? They're not even, they don't even care, or they can't grasp that sounds so far away. I'm almost 41 and still, you tell me about 60. I understand. It's hard to grasp. It's also hard to see those changes. And there's so many factors that are going to influence it that it's hard to be perfect in that sense. Let's see. So on slide 21, notice the corin and collagen type 1 and 2 and increased metalloproteinase 1, that's called collagenase. These are, of course, inducers of content changes and mechanical load changes within the bone. And when we're talking about static forces, meaning loading that is static versus dynamic, obviously we see improvements are better and adaptations are better when we're using dynamic exercise. Is it new to you to dynamic exercise is better? No, but these are part of the factors that induce these changes for the better. Okay, slide 22 is general information, and it repeats the same principles that we've talked about, so I think you can go over that by yourself. We know that microgravity is a major factor and inducer of loss of bone density and bone tissue. Gravity is very important. Without gravity, you have less loading, if at all. So definitely one of the problems of astronauts, for instance, or people that are constantly in bed rest, where gravity doesn't really apply because the mattress is doing all the work, or in water, if you were to spend much time in water, you'd have a problem in your skeletal system. We can see that people can lose up to 1.6% of their bone tissue per month. in lack of gravity conditions, and that's a lot, because don't forget that every month it's 1.6% from a decreased level of bone tissue. Okay. Of course, slide 24 is talking about the idea that bones react to exercise, and when they do, they change their content and shape, and that improves or decreases the risk of bone injury. Okay, so I'll skip over slide 25. I think it's kind of basic. We do see that sports or activities that are unilateral, although a certain extent of both sides is developed, one side is developed way more than the other, meaning that adaptations in the bones are highly localized, and once again that's because the receptors or part of the receptors are responding to a specific fluid flow within the bones. Let's see. All right. We see that gain or adaptations, some kind of increase in functionality in the bones, can be achieved almost at every age, only in different extents and different pace of or rate of improvement. But the interesting thing is that even the slightest changes to bone mineral density result in great mechanical endurance, meaning that you don't have to have in your head that crazy changes have to be induced to bone mineral density or density in general in order to see great results. Even small results are multiplied and accumulated and are very good, and that's why this is one of the major ways that we can help our patients. Okay, so slide 28 basically is referring to the basic laws of loading, and you've probably learned this in basic courses of exercise prescription. So of course the bones apply and respond to the principles of specificity, overload, reversibility, initial values, and diminishing returns, which is the basic 5 principles of that are kind of behind the scenes of writing an exercise prescription plan. We do have a lazy zone within the bone, and this is basic anatomy, and we know that bone adaptation is site-specific. So that is an area that we might see a bit of adaptation, but not much. Gain in bone characteristics and improvement are not forever, so they are reversible. We see in a lot of cases in regards to tissue and exercise that the better off you are when you start, the better off the adaptation is, and that's an important factor in the ability to improve. So that would be one of the major aspects, for instance, that I would like to know when a patient comes into the clinic. I wish they could come in with a DEXA scan. I would like to ask about that and understand where they are at, because you see that can influence the adaptation that is the adaptation as the result of the rehab program. And yes, if you think about it, you're exercising the person. If you're not attending to their bone mineral density, if you're not attending to their bones, you might not understand why you're having a decreased response to exercise or a decreased response to adaptation. And our mind goes to the cardiorespiratory system, and that's not necessarily the case. So once again, I think it's the 10th time or the 20th, it doesn't matter. Remember, as clinical exercise physiologists, that levers are important, and part of the levers are the bones. And if the bones have problems, you're not going to see the adaptation, aka the full response to the rehab plan that you are administering in these patients. Remember that it's in the background, but it's important, and it's hard to see. So there's a saying, far from the eye, far from the heart. So we can see heart rate, and we can see blood pressure, and we can see respiratory responses, but the bones are hiding one of the keys to success in this program. So I hope that in the future, I'd get an email or a call from you saying, hey, I remember this lecture, and near the place where I work or within the place where I work there's a DEXA, and we use this periodically to understand other processes. And remember one more thing, you are not always exposed to the person's nutrition, right? But if you do DEXA scans, you can see improvements, and you can kind of indirectly understand if they're eating correctly or not, which is very, very important. So we have obviously a reverse relationship with gain. This is usually seen in tissues because the higher bone mass that you start with, the less you have until you reach peak bone mass. So it's just a mathematical idea, which is pretty simple. Obviously, with every tissue, the amount of blood flow, BF for short, is a major factor influencing the tissue's ability to function and heal. So that's what we're talking about on slide 30. Notice that the second point on slide 30 is a very important point here. That is that it is found in regards to the skeletal system that more bouts per day of exercise induce better adaptation than prolonged exercise. That's very, very important. That can, of course, influence the professional need to have them exercise at home. So having a home-based exercise prescription or plan. Very, very important. We know that the renal system is a major system that most times is I won't say forgotten, but kind of underestimated perhaps by clinicians, because the cardiorespiratory system. No, understand that without the renal system, with dysfunctional kidneys or disorders or diseases in your kidneys, you're going to suffer on so many levels. Most kidney diseases affect immediately the cardiorespiratory super system, but also the skeletal system. So you can see that the reabsorption of calcium, which is very important, to the bones, and we already established, I hope by now, the importance of the bones to function and adaptation to exercise is great. So next time when you hear that someone has a renal problem, yes, they have problem with blood pressure, and they're going to have problems with their cardiorespiratory system. They're going to have problems with water intake and viscosity, but they're also going to have problems in their bones. So the next time that you're a clinician I mean, you are going to be a clinician. The next time that someone comes in and you see that they have kidney problems, I want you to address their bones. And I want to see if they've had their skeletal system checked and their bone density checked. And if not, please provoke, induce that process and follow up, because that's very, very important. Very important. Okay, let's see. So yeah, bone problems obviously can produce pain and gait changes and psychological influences. Obviously, pain will influence someone's psychological aspect, but even if they're not experiencing pain, the change in gait is a change of something that that person was doing every day, all day long, and suddenly a pattern is changed that immediately influences the brain and the stimulus of the brain and the information that the brain is getting from receptors. There's no way that this is not going to influence the person, so we have to be sensitive to that. Of course, there are gender-based differences in the system, both psychologically and physiologically. We can see that women develop what we call the female athlete trait, which is a combination of eating disorders, anuria, and osteoporosis. And this is a very important aspect to monitor with female patients. Usually this disorder or this phenomenon is triggered by extremely intensive exercise. So that can be HIIT, and that's definitely a current trend in rehabilitation. Notice that when we're talking about amenorrhea, it's a metabolic condition, whereas the energetic availability is reduced dramatically. Okay, let's continue. So once again, on slide 34, we're talking about the relationship between adolescence, what we've done when we were young, to our ability as adults to cope and the tissues that we find. This is obviously a serious problem. If we could monitor adolescents and make sure or give them better solutions, we would definitely in the long run find better adults biologically and health-wise, and definitely have people in rehab, God forbid, that are better equipped, so to speak, biologically to adapt and respond to rehab. Notice the last point on slide number 34, that although bone mineral capacity does increase, does react, that's what we call BMC, or bone mineral concentration, does increase, the adaptation is not automatic. Once again, the adaptation to exercise is not automatic. So it depends on very powerful factors such as genes, diet, hormones, obviously, and developmental conditions. So someone might not have the right balance of combination, and you will not see the right response to things, and that will lead to the lack of adaptation to your rehab process. Once again and again, if you don't see improvement with someone, this might be the reason and the source. So, exercising someone without knowing these things might result actually in a negative result rather than a positive result, and then you should start being suspicious. Of course, we have vitamin D receptor genes, polymorphisms, and osteocalcin polymorphisms, meaning changes at the genetic level that are linked to bone mineral density. Okay, slide 36, you can see that there's a calcium threshold in which if someone is undertaking calcium, we might not see a response to exercise, and that's about 1,000 milligrams per day. And that's very, very important. Remember that a person that is exercising is inducing the intake of calcium at 2 levels at least. At least. Remember I said that, at least. One, we know that calcium is a biophysical weight used in the actual contraction or function of the sarcomere. We know that the cross bridges cannot link without calcium affecting actin, and the second aspect is the need for calcium in the bones. If you add to that calcium is a major second messenger or a major factor of intercellular signaling, we must keep the intake of calcium at adequate levels, and that will increase when you exercise. So if someone is exercising and not adapting their calcium levels, we're going to have a problem. Okay, slide number 37. If we're talking about obesity, then high levels of fat definitely reduce calcium intake. So, of course, the bottom line is, being fat, overweight, and so on and so forth is not good, but you see another aspect of that, which immediately will reduce the ability to react to a rehabilitation program. We also see that glucose, an increase in glucose beyond normal level, increases calcium loss via the kidneys. The mechanism here is kind of known and it's a bit complex, but basically glucose influences the viscosity of the blood, and the viscosity of the blood influences blood pressure, which influences kidney function, and part of the changes or the responses to kidney functions influence the reabsorption of calcium. So that's kind of the short story of that. Let's see. We know that the responses to exercise and bone density and bone adaptation are definitely somehow affected by sex hormones. We are not sure as of yet exactly the mechanisms that, the cellular mechanisms that affect that, but we know certain relationships and indirect effects of sex hormones. Basically, in this case, women are more vulnerable to the loss of calcium due to their hormonal activity. Notice that in the elderly, and I admit that defining who is an elder is a bit tricky, but in the elderly, exercise is not enough to induce improvements in bone mineral density without hormonal therapy. So they have a decrease in hormones, and they'll probably have to have hormonal therapy in order for exercise to help. And that, once again, reflects upon questions that should be asked in the health history questionnaire, or upon enrollment into the process. Notice in slide 39, the first point is extremely important and equally depressing or aggravating, in the sense that there is a suggested window of opportunity, whereas we believe that implementation of exercise will improve skeletal growth. But it's a very wide range because there's so much growth going on and changes during adolescence that the question is, can we pinpoint the point where we have to exercise for people to get improved? And you can see that pre-puberty modeling is dominant and post remodeling is dominant, and we already talked about that. Okay. A bit about the mechanisms of bone adaptation, really fast. Once again, the actual mechanisms are not really known. We know that both direct and indirect loading, mechanical loading, induce gene expression that influences the responses of the skeletal system. And as we said, strain is a major inducer of adaptation. On slide 43, we see that the relationship between the magnitude of strain and the bone adaptation is linear. We know that there's a strain threshold that induces adaptation, meaning that beneath that threshold you will not see adaptation. The game, so to speak, is to find exactly that threshold that allows us to produce a certain adaptation to exercise. Okay, notice the last point, and I think that this is one of the major points of the presentation, and I hope that you watch this video and don't ever forget this. There is a greater influence on adaptation in the positive side of things to the amount of cycles of loading rather than the total daily load. So yes, we want people in rehab exercising small bouts, but more time. And that also, we usually do that with people starting the program. But what I'm telling you right now is that it's also important to do that even if they can have prolonged exercise or withstand prolonged exercise. So within the program, within the plan, it would be good to plant few exercises, maybe couple of days during the week that they exercise in the morning and at noon, even for 10 minutes. That would be enough to induce a better result to the skeletal system. And once again, I'm doing this on purpose, induce better results to the adaptation to the rehab program, thus better rehab. Alright, the same idea is kind of discussed in slide 44. Let's see. Obviously, one of the mechanisms that is identified as a good mechanism to create adaptation is one where you have ground forces going through your legs. So it's important that the activity includes contact between the legs and the ground. And we know, and we'll talk about that in the future, that there are very powerful receptors, mechanoreceptors in our feet, which influence cardiorespiratory function, meaning that the brain understands that we walk on the ground, and that's a major source and one of the initial sources of information. And apparently these receptors, the information that we receive from these receptors in the brain are perceived are very, very important. So that's very important to understand. So for instance, in this case, an elliptical If you're working only on an elliptical, if you're working only on a cycle, that's problematic. We want them walking, we want them in contact with the ground. And that's a major aspect that you have to relate to when you're conducting rehab. Okay, slide 46. I think that this is kind of understandable within itself. Nothing that we haven't talked about yet, I think. And then in the last two slides, we have the 4 phases of adaptation, bone adaptation to be exact, by exercise, which in this case, the stimulus of the adaptation is called mechanical transduction. And that, this phrase within itself, I think, explains everything. So mechanical transduction has 4 steps, which I insist on you knowing for the exam and, regardless of the exam. So the first one is what we call mechanocoupling. So this is the biophysical forces that are converted into the cellular level. And we're taking mechanical signals and transforming them into a form that the cells can understand, into signals that the cell can understand, and that results in biological responses by the cells. I want to remind you that according to the anatomical hierarchy, the cell is first. So if the cell does not get it, I'm not sure you're going to see a response. Remember that as physiologists. The second level is what we call the biochemical coupling, meaning that we want to see response to that by the extended cycles of the body, meaning hormones and enzymes and so on and so forth. So we're going to see an autocrine and paracrine response through mediators to coordinate the responses to change. And then we go into the cell-to-cell signaling, meaning that now we're at a level of communications, whereas one cell is telling the other one, hey dude, we just walked on the ground and we need to induce a change, so start getting at it. So that is the coordination between the cells. And then we have what we call the effector response, whereas we have changes to homeostasis, we have bone formation or bone resorption, meaning we see the actual change. Okay, so to summarize this presentation, you do not have the permission anymore to disregard the skeletal system. I know that you understand that it's important. I know that you understand that without it we can't move. But I want you to understand that with a non-functional or less functional system, your ability to achieve best results for your patients as clinical exercise physiologists is reduced and sometimes might be non-existent. Whenever something doesn't add up, I hope that you remember today's video, and I hope that your mind goes to the skeletal system as well. All right, have fun.